This afternoon is a special delight and indeed an honor to have Daniel Libeskind here and his wife Nina and their daughter. Daniel and I have known each other for many, many years, though we've not been in touch for a very, very long time. And many of you have come to know Daniel and his work more recently, but he really is not only one of the most now creative and productive architects in the world, but also, in my judgment, one of the most thoughtful and culturally sophisticated architects in the world. And I got drawn into discussions with architects in the mid-'80s, I think, and then that conversation continued throughout the '90s, and it's still, that work still engages my interest. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But one of the things that I was surprised to discover was how many architects during that period, and I'll come back to that, were genuinely interested in philosophical and in some instances theological issues and problems. And they were very sophisticated. And Daniel was one of the chief among them. But before turning to some of that, it's impossible not to note and acknowledge the major event that happened on Friday when, as I'm sure most of you saw, they hoisted what will be the tower on top of the World Trade Building up to the height. And I was just wondering, Daniel, if you were there, or even if you weren't, I mean, what that moment was like for you.
Let me just, before I start, say something about Mark. You know, his works, and he as a person who's one of, I think, the most inspiring thinkers today, is someone whose work I'm very close to, and I followed, even if I haven't been close to him personally in the last few years because I've been flying around the world. He's a fantastic writer, fantastic thinker. So I'm really honored to be sitting next to him. What did I feel? I felt that this is, I think as most people felt, a very important moment in which the affirmation of life has superseded the tragedy of death. It's a moment which brought a new sense of the sky to New York. And, you know, in my master plan, I fought for this with many people. I insisted that the height of that spire be a very particular height. It's 1776, 1776. And people said, like, why? Why can't it be 1778? Why not just make it just, it's the tallest building in New York? But I thought that the height of a building is not expressed by its physical height, but by the symbolism of its aspiration. And I thought, just knowing, someone might know, someone might read somewhere, that this height is not an arbitrary height of just the highest building in New York or in America, but a height that to me will be unsurpassed because it refers to human rights. I mean, the Declaration of Independence is really the first document of human rights to the world. So I was very inspired when that element went up, and I think when the other buildings, companion buildings, Tower 2, 3, 4, will be completed, you will see my intent that the entire skyline is a kind of a torch around that sense of public space, which is occupied by the memorial and the cultural space of New York. So yes,
we haven't talked, so I don't know how you feel about the memorial, but personally I found it extraordinarily moving. I mean, the use of negative space and personal inscription of names at the center of it. Our son was in the building next to the towers when it went down, and you know, that, you're going back there and visiting it, but it's the use of negative space.
Oh, absolutely. For those who might not really know this very well from my master plan, what I did in the master plan was very different from almost all my colleagues who are great architects and great planners, which is to leave almost half of the site empty. You know, almost everyone suggested, well, build where there is space to be built. But out of the 16 acres, which is not a large site, 8 acres are public space in my plan. And I decided not to build in the center of the site, which is where all the proposals actually were proposed. Because I thought, even though this has never been declared anything but piece of real estate of New York, it's not a place you can actually build. It's not really a secular place. It's a spiritual space. And therefore, I pushed my buildings really to the utmost periphery of that site, leaving the space to be illuminated without the shadows of tall buildings, and also to reduce the height of buildings. Instead of making one tall building or two tall buildings or a mega structure, really distribute the density so that the buildings can be as close to the streets as possible in order to create a better streetscape, less wind tunnels, a better sense of perspectives for people who are really walking on the streets and not just seeing it as an emblem from a great distance. So that's really part of that notion of the memorial. And one other achievement, which might not be glorious, but I fought for it and I succeeded, is to eliminate all infrastructure between the memorial itself and the bedrock. Now, this is very expensive real estate, and everybody and all things and all infrastructure wants to occupy the space in the center of the site. But I thought to go all the way down where the slurry wall was revealed, where the bedrock, where people perished, where there is a visceral sense of something really incredible when you descend there, to keep that space empty. And the museum, which will be opening, I think, this September 11th, will be there. And I think people will see that it's not just the footprints, but the fact that the footprints really go all the way down to that space, and you see that slurry wall, you get that emotion. And by the way, I also proposed, Michael Arad's memorial is beautiful. I proposed the waterfalls in the original competition, which were highly, people were very, the tabloids were all against saying, you know, waterfalls in New York, it's crazy. You don't bring water, you know, Niagara Falls to the center of Lower Manhattan. But I thought it was good to have that sound of water screening the busy sights, sounds of the streets around, and also bringing a sense of something natural into a very hardscape environment.
And it's been appropriated now with Olafson's waterfalls along the river.
That's right.
I'll come back to some of this, because one of the things that I think is powerful in your architecture, and I'll try to raise this in relationship to the Jewish Museum in Berlin, is precisely this deployment of the void in such an important way, and the interplay between emptiness and silence, which are so important. But let me back up just a little bit. I said that we first met in the early 90s. That was a period of extraordinary creativity in architecture, it seems to me, not the least of which was a result of discussions in theory and with philosophers and architects and the like. And I, as a result of some of that, ended up teaching at Columbia School of Architecture for a while. And I have always thoroughly enjoyed teaching architecture students because they're so different from students in philosophy alike. They are genuinely interested in the ideas, but they don't really care whether they understand Kierkegaard as Kierkegaard scholars do. They're interested in the ideas that they can take and steal and use in their work in creative ways. So my question to you to begin is, who are the philosophers from whom you have most productively stolen?
That's a great question. I'm not an academic in that sense, so I won't be really accurate, but certainly, since this is a day of Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard would have been one of the writers whose works I read when I was younger. Definitely, I read a lot of Kierkegaard. Actually, I probably have almost all his books in my library, but I think all contemporary philosophers were of interest, but also I developed an interest for ancient philosophy, wherever it might have been, whether it's Greek, Chinese, Hindu, whatever. So yes, I've always been interested in books and in reading, and I think that's not something apart from architecture, because we know from architectural history that architecture is very closely related to philosophy and to thinking and to thought. Not least of which is the Vitruvian commentary in his book that architecture originated with language, and the word that he says, I'm interpreting a little bit, was at the origin of architecture was the shout of fire, that there was fire, and people shouted there was fire, and then everybody ran, and then they realized what architecture was. So, between fire, language, philosophy, and the contemporary, I think, yes.
So you trained as to become a professional pianist at one point.
I was a professional musician.
Right.
Actually, I was a virtuoso on the accordion,
right.
A strange instrument. But I have to tell you, it's kind of funny, but it's also, there's pathos to it, because I grew up in Poland under a communist dictatorship. Let's not forget that, with incredible anti-Semitism. My parents were Holocaust survivors. We didn't leave Poland immediately after those events. We were behind the Iron Curtain. And I wanted to play the piano, but the virulence of anti-Semitism was so large that my parents were afraid to bring a piano to the courtyard because of our neighbors. So they brought this thing in a suitcase and said, here's the piano, but it happened to be the accordion, which was something that could be snuck in through the courtyard without the neighbors noticing that the Jews had brought the piano. So I was, in a way, sort of sentenced to play that instrument, in which I transcribed Baroque works. When I won the America-Israel Prize in Music, which is not an easy prize to get when I came to Israel, because the year I won was also the year that Itzhak Perelman won. And we are friends. Daniel Barenboim won it the year before. I was the only person competing on this instrument. And the jury, Mrs. Kusevitsky, Zino Franciscati, and Isaac Stern said to me, how did you wind up playing this instrument? You know, where is the piano? So yeah, that's my fate. But music, certainly, yes, that's how I started.
Now, years ago, when sometime we would meet, I know that you started your day not by working in the studio there, but by taking several hours to read, to listen to music, and the like. Life has taken you many places since then, and the frenzy of life may not allow that anymore. But reflect a little bit on the role that music has played in your architecture.
It's a crucial role, and by the way, I still do the same things.
That's great.
You know, it's not that, I always consider that people who are busy are people who do nothing. People are always busy. So no, I am busy, but I'm hoping to do something. But that something is based on two things. Number one, I don't feel I've really actually given up music. It's strange, because I don't play an instrument, not that instrument, not a keyboard of that sort, but I do feel that my instrument continues to be informed by my love and actually even physical and emotional connection to music, because architecture is beyond the Pythagoreans, beyond all the references to music that traverse history of architecture. Music is very close to architecture in the following sense, that it is very, very precise mathematically. It's absolutely precise, cannot be off by even a vibration. But at the end, it's not an intellectual art. It uses intellectual means to register into the soul of a human being. No one really listens to music thinking what is Bach doing in this passage, in the fugue, or in this, because it's mind-boggling to think about it when you're listening. But the music, it has an impact which is immediate, and I think it's true for architecture. It's very intellectual field, architecture. You have to really be able to be very precise, very mathematical, totally in control. But at the end, the means of the materiality really is used to actually subvert itself in order to reveal something other than stone and glass and steel, but communicate something other to. So music is, to me, really a fundamental, not an extra element of my work.
Okay. So I'd like to discuss a little bit now the relationship between building and not building, whereas I've sometimes said building not. For many years, you and some of your distinguished colleagues did not actually build. And yet you had an enormous influence through your writings, your theoretical works, and various projects and models. Can you discuss the relationship between that early work, where you were not actually building, and the work that you've done since you have actually been building?
Well, first of all, let me say that I don't consider architecture just constrained to building. Architecture transcends it, it's beyond building. Drawing might even be in some way more fundamental, more incredible than a building, even though it's such a unimportant, seemingly unimportant material fact, just a piece of paper. But drawing is the source of my work. So everything I've developed was out of drawing. I didn't develop it out of taking pieces of buildings of other buildings and putting them together, or out of interest in technology, or out of interest in economics. I developed them out of a strange search or quest through drawing. Now, I drew very early on, but I had no commissions. And I didn't draw imaginary buildings. I have to say that's important. Because a lot of architects who don't have jobs, who are unemployed, draw fantasy buildings, fantasies of architecture. I thought it was not possible to draw fantasies of architecture, because architecture is not a fantasy. It depends on cultural, economic, social, political context. So I drew really kind of in between the lines that I was able to generate as a road, as a path, leading me to sort of an obscure future. But those drawings which I created in a series of drawings, micromegas, chamber works, which were sort of series of drawings, which I did not consider art, by the way. I considered them fully architecture, though most people thought I was avoiding architecture, or it was some sort of a commentary on architecture. But those drawings led me to building, because my drawings for the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which was my first building, never built anything, were really those drawings, but kind of magnified in some sort of segmented way. And I continue to use those drawings. They are not, and I continue to produce new drawings, the 100 drawings of the sonnets. So yes, to me, that is architecture. It is drawing.
Somewhere I wrote that Kierkegaard is as close to Judaism as you can get and still be a Christian in certain ways. There's certain affinities between Kierkegaard's version of Christianity and certain versions of Judaism. I also always have insisted that religion is not simply something that goes on in churches and synagogues and mosques, but that it's most influential often where it's least obvious. To take somebody like Derrida, whom we both knew and from whom we learned so much, I've often said that you can't really understand Derrida without understanding the importance of the fact that he was an Algerian Jew. For you, would like to ask you to reflect a little bit on the importance of being a Polish Jew, some of the autobiographical facts that you've just mentioned, and your work as an architect.
Well, I can't separate the two. I'm not, here I am what I am, and then I do sort of objective work as a worker in an industrial plant. My work is rooted in my experience, and in the experience of those who were very close to me, but who I never met, who were exterminated in the Holocaust. And in the cities of the void. You know, I grew up in Łódź, Poland. You know, Poland had 3 million Jews before the Shoah, before the Holocaust. I grew up, there were hardly any Jews. There were no Jews. My parents were virtually the only survivors of their large family. So inevitably, when I started working on what was then not called the Jewish Museum, but was called the Berlin Museum with Jüdische Abteilung, it was a mission. I had a notion that you cannot build a Berlin museum with an Abteilung, with a department of Jews that have disappeared from the city, but that you should shift the entire program into a sense across this emptiness, across the void, across the abyss, to create a hope that isn't obvious, but can only traverse that space without ever forgetting it. So I use the memory of my own memory, but also the memory of the city to really generate a sense of a place. So yes, to say that I'm Jewish and that I'm a Polish Jew in particular and that I come from this generation is to say that all my work, now if you build a housing project or a hospital or a school, it might be less obvious, but I think it's not that different. You know, buildings have different typologies, different senses, but I continue to bring my very, very specific experience to it, not a general experience.
So let's take it from there to the Berlin Museum or the Jewish Museum. I mean, that was your first building, and it's really an extraordinary accomplishment. It was an accomplishment not only architecturally, but politically through all, and you may want to reflect on that with Hermann Kohl, if I remember right, or through several administrations and the like. And the intricacy and the subtlety of the design, I think, are arresting in every sense of the word. There's a subtle interplay between below ground and above ground. The complexity of the relationship between presence and absence, or structure and void that we've talked about, as well as the play of darkness and light. And perhaps the most provocative is, as I say, the way in which the void in a certain way creates the building, in a very Heideggerian way, it seems to me. Everything seems designed to keep people off balance. Now, you won this competition in 1989, but it wasn't completed for a decade later. It was an enormously ambitious and controversial project at that time. During the period when you were working on this project, as I say, was an extraordinarily traumatic one in the history of the West, the fall of the Soviet Union, collapse of the Berlin Wall, and so on and so forth. Can you talk a bit about what went into your thinking on that project and the challenges of seeing it through to completion, and some of the ways in which you came to see it playing a role in the new Germany and new Europe that were emerging at the time of these seismic shifts?
It's a very complex question to really answer quickly, but I can only say this, that I won the competition for Berlin Museum, the Jüdische Abteilung, in 1989. to be exactly July 4th, 1989, was announced. And I want to tell you that winning a competition, whatever it is, however it is announced, is usually a ticket to nowhere. It's usually just, particularly political competitions that have a political significance, are really just mostly exercises of rhetoric. To make it palpable to you, after the unification of Germany, after November 1989, in 1990, the Senate of Berlin voted, Senate, which is the political body that runs Berlin, it was a public project, voted unanimously to cancel the project. We don't need a Jewish museum in the new Germany. We need money for infrastructure, for unification, for making a bid to the Olympics, for all these things. I cannot credit the political travails of this building that it was built to myself. It was Nina, my wife and partner, who was sitting here, who really had the political genes, I would say, that allowed the building to become a public conversation and for the decision to be reversed. But even though the decision was reversed, there was very little money given to the building to be built year to year. So it was very difficult to maintain a studio, very difficult to maintain people to work on it. That's why it took, by the way, from 1989, when I received the so-called contract in 1990, till from 1989 to 2012, to be exactly September 11, 2011, 9/11, September 11th, 2001. That is when the building opened to the public. That's when it was completed, exactly on the day of terror in New York. And it closed its doors on that day. It opened at about 10:30 in the morning. It closed its doors about 2:38, exactly after the attacks, which happened here at around 8:40 in New York. And it is implicated. You know, history is, in a strange way, somehow strangely interconnected, strangely. But my notion of building this museum went against the grain of what both the politics of Berlin, what even the famous architects and museum directors wanted. Werner Hauptmann, the head of the Nationalgalerie, was part of an issue of Bauwelt, the famous German magazine. The entire issue was an attack on the building, that the building is crazy, that the building cannot be understood, that even if the building was understood, nobody would ever go into it, that even when people went into it, they would not know why they were there, which is all really not true, because I based the building not on a sentimental idea of German Jewish history, not on a nostalgia for a lost culture, but on a sort of a para-architectural building that really was based on philosophy, on literature that I loved, on incomplete music of Schoenberg, on Walter Benjamin's one-way streets, on E.T.A. Hoffmann's views from the windows at night, on Paul Celan's Oranienburger Strasse #1, which is right abutting the museum, that great poem. So I built it on a totally different sense, in a totally different way. And you can also appreciate that the Senate of Berlin did not want to appropriate money for spaces that had no exhibitions. But I said, you must have a space that has nothing. And they said, no, but we're paying money. We're paying for a museum. It has to have something. And I said, that's the something, that nothing is part of the experience, that people should experience, that it's not the objects or the fragments, but the fact that the spiritual carriers have been eradicated from the city. So there should be a moment of reflection about that. At the same time, you have to provide a hope, something that will engage the public in understanding the complexity of exile, of extermination, of continuity across this strange city. So yes, it was it was my first building, first of all. I also never built anything before, you have to remember, not even a small building. And I have to tell you a very funny story, if you don't mind an anecdote. I won the competition. I said winning is just not important. And a new senator, who was a social democrat, came to power. The CDU was defeated. He came to power, and his first act was to scrap all the projects previously approved. Stephen Hall's American Library, all the big projects. And the next project was, of course, the Jewish Museum, which was selected by the previous administration. He came in, his name was Senator Nagel, Senator Nail, appropriately. He came, the Senate of Berlin had a meeting. They were all waiting for him. He was supposed to appear at 6 o'clock. He didn't arrive till 10 o'clock, and the whole bureaucracy of the Senate was waiting. I was there, and the senator demanded the other 25 top projects. So it was clear. he came in, ran in with TV cameras and so on, kind of, it was raining, he had a raincoat on, and he came straight to me, and he said to me, "What did you build before?" He pointed his finger and he said, "What did you build before?" And I was really kind of unprepared for that question, especially because I had built nothing. And then he said, even more emphatically, when I was silent, "What big buildings did you build in the past that qualify you to build this project?" And out of desperation, I said, "If you go by the past, Senator Nagel, Berlin is not going to have any future." So he stopped for a second. He stopped for a second. It's, you know, it's a short but very sort of intense man. And he said, and he pointed at my project, which was right next to him. He said, "How do I get into this building?" And I said, "For you, Senator, there's no door. Because there is no door to Jewish history like that. You don't go through the new building. You have to enter into the darkness of the Enlightenment, which is the old Baroque building. And in the darkness of the Enlightenment, just delve into what happened to Moses Mendelssohn, to Lessing, to all these. Then you can underground get a." And then he started thinking, and I could see his face changed. You know, he had a different agenda, but he started thinking differently. And after a few minutes, he extended his hand. He said, "You know, you should build this building in my city." So, you know, sometimes buildings depend on a desperate answer to a very aggressive politician who had kind of accurately diagnosed that I have never built a building.
All about nothing. All right, let's shift from Germany a bit north to Copenhagen. As I indicated in the book over there, in the courtyard right next to the Royal Library, there's a statue of Kierkegaard, the most famous one in Denmark. And as I've said, his papers are in the library. The Danes have long been justifiably proud of their contributions to the resistance during the Second World War. And in 2004, the Danish Jewish Museum, which is located next to the Royal Library, opened. You designed this remarkable structure. Could you offer some reflections on it and whether Kierkegaard entered into any of your ideas when doing that, and sort of the difference between the settings of Copenhagen with its very different history in relationship to the Second World War and the Holocaust, and Berlin and its history, and I mean how those differences shaped the way in which you went about the Danish.
It's a great question. First of all, let me say that when I first arrived to that site and I was asked if I would do this museum, it's called the Jewish Museum. It isn't in the old library. It's in the Royal Library. And of course, it's that square with the statue of Kierkegaard and the Parliament buildings there. It's really the very quiet center of this beautiful city. I thought a lot about it because the museum had to deal with the Jewish history, the Danish Jews. And I was in a space which was given. It's a space that has no external appearance at all. It's within the library, Royal Library, which had moved out. The Royal Library, as you know, was also its origins where the ships were stored of King Christian IV. That's where the ships. So it had the nautical history. And I thought of Kierkegaard. I thought of the nautical history. I also thought of the strange saving of the Danish Jews. Almost 95% of Danish Jews were saved by being able to escape from Denmark on small boats, sometimes bigger boats, to Sweden. And so I created a museum within this. It's based on a very complex, emblematic reading of the word mitzvah, which in Hebrew means the good deed of the Danes, the good deed of people who did something in this dark period which had some light. But I always thought about how did this happen? It's not black and white. It is not true that the Danish king put a yellow star on. It is not true that it was all just a making of the Danes. There was a German diplomat who made the call, the fateful call. I think his name was Dackwitz. He was the diplomat who made a call knowing that Jews were to be deported after the fall, the resignation of the Danish parliament and Germany in 1943 taking over the administration of the country, who made the fateful call to someone who was the head of the Social Democratic Party and to tell them that the Jews were going to be all deported. And then it began to coalesce. And
so I saw the complexity of the absurdity, the enigma, the mystery, the accidentality of this story to be told. So I created within this building a kind of a labyrinth. It's a labyrinth. It's not a big building, in which the floors are wooden, and they really go up and down. There's exhibits places are between or in between the vaulted structures of this ancient library. And you get a sense of dizziness. I wanted a sense of instability, but there's a kind of horizon of light that cuts through, and it's based on the exhibits. And the exhibits, I think, are very moving, because Danish Jews were very integrated, assimilated, you could say, practicing the Judaism in a very, very open society, almost a model society in Europe. And it's an intimate story of the Danish Jews. So it's a very special building, and I always thought of Kierkegaard. I absolutely. By the way, when I was a professor, I was a visiting professor to the Royal Danish Academy, and I did a project, not with architects. There were mostly painters, sculptors. We did a project to investigate Kierkegaard, and we had an exhibition actually in Copenhagen at the Royal Academy with some fantastic works of great sculptors, great artists. We delved into the physical spaces which Kierkegaard observed where he walked, how his complex personality was developed with this, and in this city, even though he took 4 trips, I think, to Berlin. So anyway, I found it very engaging and a very special project, very small. There's only a small door that opens to the museum, but something very moving and kind of Kierkegaardian, because to me it is a leap of faith. There is a leap of faith in it. There is also the absurd. There's something absurd about it. There is also that strange, almost voyeuristic view from different points of view of the exhibit, that you can have a different sense, like you're looking at founders of Tuborg and Carlsberg, 2 Jewish families that founded the famous beer companies of Denmark. So to me, it had not an academic relationship to Kierkegaard, but I think his sense of being, which is so much part of that city also, kind of modesty, but also great strength, great resilience in emotion. To me, that's Denmark, sort of Danish people. They're very quiet, very humble, but there is an inner strength that transcends, let's say, the Berliners or, the Americans even.
Daniel mentioned Carlsberg, and one of the remarkable things about the Carlsberg breweries is that they set up a cultural fund, and they're very, very generous in sponsoring cultural projects throughout Denmark. And they've been the primary funders of Kierkegaard scholarship and research for many, many years. So it's a marvelous experience to know that you can drink as much more Carlsberg beer you drink, the more you're supporting Kierkegaard and cultural work.
That's it.
Now, you've been involved, and I confess I don't know the details of this, but you also have been involved, I gather, in organizing or developing an exhibition that has moved around in Denmark, or can you just tell us what that exhibition is? And
well, I was involved in the original. I mean, the archives are huge in Denmark, and I was involved in the original research. But I can't claim that I'm the person who's invented the way to present this history and this archive to the world.
So. I wish we had much more time. It's running short, but I want to, in one of the earlier sessions, and we'll have more on this later, I think. There's been an acknowledgement of the role that Kierkegaard played in being one of the first critics of the mass media in the present age, in particular. For Kierkegaard, the mass media that he was primarily concerned with were the press, advertising, and pamphlets. And part of what he worried about with that mass media was, as Abby was saying earlier, was the way, and some of the questions referred to, the way in which mass media really repressed individuality and made all people into what Heidegger later would call the one, the crowd and everything. Now, most of us have not had the experience of becoming the celebrity that you have had with the advent of the World Trade Center project. As you say, you've built some, you're a philosophical architect, and all of a sudden, you're thrown into this celebrity culture and mass media culture in an extraordinary way, which I can only imagine was for a while and perhaps still is disorienting in some ways. How do you navigate that space? How do you not have it do to you what Kierkegaard worried this new emerging culture would do to people?
Well, he was certainly a prophet of the truth, that the distortion of media, the agendas of so-called public press. When I won the Jewish Museum, I was called American Jewish Architect won the competition. When I won Ground Zero, Polish Architect won Ground Zero. You know, it's interesting that the press, the role of press in relation to my buildings at least, and I've done a lot of cultural buildings that have never been instantly embraced as, you know, by this as a style or as a something that people immediately say, oh, this is a nice building, this is a nice idea. Press has always played a very important role because press is represented by the powers that there are. And I don't have to tell you that you have to have a pretty hard skin to withstand it and remain a normal person, a rational person, because if not, you probably would become a revolutionary. You would start really the underground against the mass media, the collusion of mass media with finance, the collusion of mass media with political power. So I think he was prescient, Kierkegaard. I think the world hasn't gotten less less disconnected from the powers that are, but more. And I can only tell you that doing ground, you know, now it's subsided. That the tone of opinion has changed. People are beginning to say, this is an interesting project, despite all the fights, the consensus that a master plan brought as a vision for what to rebuild and how to rebuild in exact spatial sense. It actually works, it's something good. But it took a long time for this to come. It's 2000, the competition was 2003. A decade after, the opinion is beginning to change. So in architecture, as in anything, I think you have to have pretty thick skin. And it's a marathon. It's not really a sprint. You have to be willing to put yourself into the, you know, you are inevitably going to be in the media, and you will be distorted, and things that you do will be distorted, and you have to stick to what you're doing, despite it, if you can. Not everybody can.
All right, let me conclude by going back to the beginning and a comment you made. And that is the tension, and here's the Kierkegaardian moment, the tension between despair and hope in all of your work. I cannot imagine the challenge that you faced in trying to figure out how to deal with the devastation of Ground Zero. As I said, our son was in the building next to one of the towers when I went down, and I was firmly convinced that it was important for him, and I did it with him, to go back to the site as soon as we could. And we went down about 2 days after when there was no one else there. And I still remember coming around the corner. It was dusk, and floodlights were on the site. And we came around the corner and saw, you remember that that steel grid work, that it was smoldering, the smoke was still coming out and the light. And two things struck me. One was how exquisitely beautiful that structure was. The first thought I had was Richard Serra could never do that, right? The second was the only language that somehow seemed appropriate in that moment was a certain kind of language of the sacred, as being in the presence of sort of unmasterable power, destructive in this case. But to take that kind of destruction and try to find a way from that, not to take it down the path of despair, but to hope. Talk a little bit about that.
This is probably the key to the development of the site, in my view, and that's what my plan is about. It's very easy after this event either to forget, to say it never happened, or to shift New York City, America, towards a pessimism that would be associated with this site, an eternal pessimism. How can it be ever optimistic? It's irretrievable. So I tried to create a different notion, use the memory of that day, of that particular day, and of the tragedy of the deaths, not just of the thousands, but the implication of those deaths, as a kind of Archimedean point to leverage a city of the future, as a 21st century New York. So to use the memory as a structural foundation, not just in terms of its spatial, but conceptual, also how to distribute the buildings, where to put them, what to do, how to use the various devices. For example, that the buildings distributed around the site would have, though they are standing in the grid, a reference as a composition to the Torch of Liberty, which is just to the south of the tower. Now, Wedge of Light, an additional public space, which is not in the competition, is a very expensive real estate, believe me. I created a space which will be almost the size of San Marco, going from Broadway, as you enter from Broadway towards the memorial site, that is really shaped by light of that date, 8:46 a.m. when the first tower was struck, 10:28 when the second tower collapsed, which is now the center of that amazing path terminal of Calatrava. So again, an additional space of memory in the light of New York. So everything on that site sits in a way as a testament or a devotion of meaning to a particular date and a particular group of people who, it could have been any one of us who perished. So it is almost absurd to think of 10 million square feet of office space, 5 million square feet of infrastructure, all the security and practical matters that have to be part of the site, and at the same time to create a cultural site that is for people, that is not just for the people occupying the beautiful offices. And I tell you what, my parents were all, both of my parents were workers in New York. They were, my mother worked in the garment, sweatshops of the garment industry. My father worked as a printer on Stone Street. And I thought, you know, New Yorkers will never be in those towers. And some New Yorkers will be in those towers, but most New Yorkers will be on the streets, in the subways, on the pattern, you know, caring for their families, running, trying to make a better life. They're immigrants. They're just coming in. What is it for them? What is the site for people of New York? It's not about, you know, the glorious towers, although they have to be glorious because they will also have fantastic importance on the site. So I shaped the site really to maximize public space and to maximize the power of cultural space, which is memorable, which extends in depth in the horizon and vertically from the slurry wall. To me, that was the art of the design. Of course, people talked about money, they talked about politics, they talked about emotions, but at the end, one would have to garner a certain consensus without any irony. And I'm a believer. You know, without being a believer, you can't garner that. You can't stick in this process. You would die if you were an ironist or very clever or skeptic. You have to be a believer, and you have to be a believer, and like all believers, you have to believe, and the belief makes sometimes a way. And I'm actually quite amazed if I think of the powerful investors and their political allies who wanted all the buildings next to Wall Street because that's, you know, the closest to Wall Street. I thought, no, get them as far away from Wall Street as possible because it's too dark and too dingy for people to be on those small streets. Put the buildings where there's air, where there's Hudson River, where there are no tall buildings. So there were many things that were reversed. And what I love about America, and I think this is true, that this is not a site that was given as a tabula rasa, build whatever you want and it's going to get built, as we see in places which have powerful political systems that don't allow any public participation. In our society, you have to reach a consensus, and people have to all agree. And it's dirty, and it's messy, and as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst of all systems. It's a terrible system, but it's the best of all the systems. And I agree with it, that after all these people, whether they're governors, four governors, now a second mayor is going to come, 4 heads of the Port Authority, different investment circles, that at the end, somehow, this sense of what it means came through and is evident, will be evident in the spatial, physical, and symbolic planning of the space. So I have no skepticism about democracy. It's hard, and you don't get to win all the fights. You have to compromise on some things. The spire that I proposed for the Freedom Tower was different from the spire of the architects who designed the tower now. But nevertheless, there is a sense of moving towards a certain direction that I feel is the right one. So that's kind of the story, the sense of that you have to struggle somehow and also have a lot of good luck. I mean, I call it good luck, call having, you know, an incredible wife who you love and works with you. And in the dark periods, if I was there alone, maybe I would have committed suicide. But I didn't, because I have a partner who is more rational than I am. So you have to have good luck. You know, the Jewish Museum, you have to have good luck. I don't know, there was a good luck. There was the evening that Senator Nagel came, maybe that was just good luck. It was just, he didn't have the koyach, as they say in Yiddish, the wherewithal to try to do something else. So he sort of said, okay, go ahead, build this building. Wasn't that easy. But in any case, I think there is something that you have to have from the outside, that is not generated by you, that isn't coming from you, and it's, who knows what you call it. Call it good luck, call it
Grace.
Grace, yeah, use any word, call it whatever you want to call it. But it's there, because to me that's the thing that gets the thing built. It's not what you can control, it's that which you cannot control, whatever you say, but it's real.
So I do think Kierkegaard is here, and I think he's smiling that we would end a discussion like this on a note of the absurd. To Nina and to Rachel and to Daniel, our deepest gratitude for taking time out of an extraordinary busy schedule to be here with us today. But more importantly, thank all of you for the remarkable work you are doing for us and for culture today.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.